So this one here is a step-by-step voiced process video, which I'll be going through from start to finish on how I created this piece and giving you some tips and tricks along the way. So let's get right into it. Just like the usual, I don't really like working with a blank canvas, so I'm going to start off with a gradient, and usually consists of a lighter color and a darker color. Now we're going to start off with creating an interesting silhouette. This will be your main focal point, this will be your centerpiece. So we're just going to start off by creating some shapes, play around with shapes, play around with the silhouettes, make something interesting, whether it be a mountain or a structure. Just make sure that the shape is strong, the shape is readable. So, and when I mean readable is when you look at the shape without any sort of details whatsoever, you will be able to tell somewhat what it is. Is it a mountain? Is it a structure? Is it a building? Or is it a creature? Right? So, and that's what I mean by, having that readability in your silhouette. And make sure to nail that before you even get further into the detailing, right? So sort that out first. Then you can start playing around with what your surface light color would be. Now I kind of started with a color palette, but you can tell that it's not on my screen anymore, which means that I've already kind of gotten rid of it. I think I'm just going to play around with the color palette as I go, and yeah, just go with the flow. And just remember, there's actually no right or wrong to your shape. If it suits the concept that you're trying to go for, or the idea that you're trying to go for, and it meets the idea that you had imagined in the first place, then that's great. That means it's working, right? So I'm going to go with an arc shape here. I'm going to create the mountain, and I'm going to start playing around with the same color palette. So having the orange as my surface lighting color here, and I'm just going to blast in some lines, blast in some shapes, just to get an idea of where things will sit. So obviously you can see like the big long horizontal lines I've got in the middle there. That's going to be my horizon line. So that's going to be where my perspective is going to be working off. So I'm going to go with an arc shaped cliff. As you can see there, kind of looks like a boat, but it's going to be like a mountain or a cliff, right? And I'm going to just add some water into the foreground here, and that's just going to help me break that midground there a little bit and help create some separation. It's simple. I just added up a new layer on top and just painted in like a rectangle block basically, and then added in some darker blues in the foreground area just to create some shadows. After that, you can then populate your water to make it look more like water by adding in some rocks. Just keep them as simple shapes for now. Now, as you can see before, I was playing around with that nice warm orange, and that's going to be my surface light. So for the cliff here, I'm just going to open up a new layer and then do a clipping mask on top of it, and then start painting in some surface lighting. And wherever you're placing the light surface textures, like what I'm doing here, that's going to help your viewers and help you identify where your lighting is coming from. And then this will, going ahead will work as your reference point. Should you ever struggle with where your light's coming from, or you're not sure how to land it on your surfaces, on your elements, you can refer back to how you've got it here, and this will be your guide to adding in light to your other elements as you add them in and create them later on. Now, because I felt like the cliff and the platform that the cliff is sitting on was floating on the water, I didn't really like that. I'm going to land it a bit by just adding in some sand, and I'm just going to, like a shoreline, right? And I'm just going to keep it as just really bland sand shape, and then create some edges of where the water will be hitting and flowing on top of, right? So I'm just going to create like a bit of a line using like a sandy color, and just that'll help break it up and land the piece a little bit more instead of floating on the water I mean, it could work in terms of, you know, it could be submerged in water and it's going really deep under the water, but it's not really what I was wanting. So yeah, adding in some sand to ground it a bit. Now I felt like the dark blue that I used for my cliff there and the orange was, it needed a little bit more. I felt like it was a bit dry, it was a bit boring. So I'm just gonna, you know, add in some more nature into it. I'm gonna paint in some greens. I'm gonna create some more vegetation, some plantation, some grass on top of the platform there. And then eventually I think I'm gonna add in some trees as well, but that'll come soon. But for now, we're just gonna land some really thin, small shapes of grass and greens on the surface there. Now I want this to be quite far away, so I'm not gonna have it too big, I'm not gonna have it too detailed. And I'm just going to use like 2 tones max, so it's going to be like the base shadow layer, and then use a clipping mask on top of that to create the lighting, like what we've done with the cliff. So you can see here, I've just opened up a new layer in between the surface layer and the blocking layer of the cliff, and I'm just choosing like a slightly lighter color than the shadow, and just painting it in for some secondary details. Now this will be the details that's kind of in the shadows, so you want it to be a little bit darker, and you don't want it to clash with your lighting surface. You want this to be direct lighting, you want it to be strong lighting. Alright, so this is just going to add a little bit more grit into your shape, you know, instead of just having it as the original blocking where it was just one plain dark blue color, right? So we're just going to do a bit of that all around the place, and I'm just adding a bit more greens just on top of the sand there, and that'll help cover some of the edges, and it won't look like it's just plainly sitting there. So we're just breaking up some of those lines. Now just to fill in some of the empty space behind the cliff there, we're just going to select the darker blue. I a blue that's lighter than the cliff, but also darker than your sky gradient at the back there. We're just going to fill in some space here and paint in some background mountains here. Keep them to simple shapes. We'll come back and work on this a little bit later, but for now, it's just to get a nice feel to how to the depth of this. As you can see here, I felt like the sky blue and that back mountain blue was a little bit they were clashing a little bit, right? So I just went back to the sky gradient and just made it a little bit lighter overall. Now we're going to just leave the mountain for now, and then we're going to head on to the next part. Now we're just going to color pick from the same dark color you've got on the cliff there, and then start painting in some trees. We're going to paint in some tree trunks and branches first. You're going to figure out the flow. You want to make sure that the flow of your trunk and the branches flow first, then you can add in the leaves. Alright, as you can see here, we kind of got like a really nice horizontal flow to the piece. So we're going to make sure that our trees and the branches kind of stand upright, and then your leaves can represent that. So just make sure that everything's balanced in your piece based on the overall flow of your scene as a whole. So you can't just look at one piece of the image. You can look at the overall whole. You got to make sure that every element that you add from there aligns with that and works with it. Once you're happy with your tree silhouettes, you can then move on by adding in clipping masks on top of that blocking layer you just did, and then you can use this new layer to add in color. Right, so we're going to paint in some darker greens. We're just going to recycle the same palette. We're going to reuse the same colors that we've already got in here. So I'm just using the same greens. Perhaps the trees are a bit higher, so you can see that there's a bit more shadow on the top there. So we're just going to make the greens a little bit darker, but it's essentially the same color but a different value right? So we're just going to paint in those colors. So we're going to do this in a step-by-step process. So you're going to first, like what you did, paint in the silhouette. Then you're going to paint in some colors, some flat colors, to identify where the colors are going to go and where the colors are going to sit, right? And then you're going to do another layer on top of that later to add in the details and the lighting. So you do this in a sequential order, and and this will help you figure out a way to to know what stage to paint. And once you're done with that, you can just lock that same layer that you've just painted the flat colors in, and then you can start creating your details on there. The triangle brush that I've got here is in my brush pack. It's just a nice shape brush that I find really helpful in creating these foliage and plants, and just that tree texture looks really nice, and it's definitely like a style thing as well, so it's very much in my favor, and I really like that. So I tend to create my trees using this brush, the details actually, yeah. So you can see here I'm just painting in the shapes, creating some variations. So make sure that you paint it in different angles, just so it doesn't look too repetitive, because the shape is always going to be that one same shape. So it can look repetitive if it's not done in a way where it looks natural. Because at the end of the day, it's still a tree, so it still needs to look natural, right? And then you can just layer up the details with your branches and tree trunks as well. So we're just going to color pick from that dark color we've got there, and then turn it into, get into like a lighter brown, and just start painting in some of those textures of the tree branch and tree trunk. Oh. So yeah, so we're just gonna, it's still the same process, you're still just layering it up. So you go from shadow to the mid-tone, and then you can potentially add some lighting if the lighting is gonna hit that area. Now we're just going to quickly move back to that back mountain that we created earlier. We're just going to go in and just start painting in some tree silhouettes just to show that this whole environment in this scene consists of these mountains and cliffs and trees as well. But we're not going to get in too much detail with it. As you can see, I'm just sticking with the one color. I'm just going to create silhouettes, and that way it's just going to show that the atmosphere has pushed it so far back that it's just turned blue because, you know, the nature, because of the sky. The sky color has affected it in that way. So as you can see here, I'm just creating some variations. I've created a small one down here, and then I've got like a really nice big one further on the other side there. Right, so just create some variations, but just stick to the simple shapes and limit your detail because you don't need much. As you can see, it works, right? And that's the power of atmospheric perspective. And you can get away with a lot more. And it's in terms of getting away with a lot more, it's not intentionally trying to do less work. You're actually doing yourself a favor. You're doing your composition a favor by showing depth and the use of atmosphere, and it will just bring a lot of attention to your focal point here, which is the centerpiece, the cliff there, and the trees, without distracting it, while at the same time filling in that void of space. Now, if you do feel like your composition still has quite a lot of empty space and you want to fill it a little bit more, you can just go in and at the back, open up a new layer and create more mountains like what I'm doing right here. Just make sure that the value of your blue or your whatever color that you're using, should you be using a different palette, make sure that the value you're using is darker than the color in the sky, aka the background, but also lighter than the color of the object in front of it. Right, so you're just going to go lighter and lighter as you get further and further out, right? Because that's how atmospheric works. And once you're done with that, you can always add in some lighter color underneath it, just to create some fog, like up there, and it just creates some really nice separation. Now you can just go in and clean up and refine areas all over your piece. As you can see here, I'm just doing that right now. Just going in, touching up some of the edges, actually making the grass look more like grass as opposed to just dabs of paint. But I usually tend to keep them quite loose anyways, because I really love the energy of having that looseness in my paintings and my strokes. Now I want to show you a quick way to just add some reflections to your water. So as you can see here, what you're going to do is go into your rock layers, duplicate all those layers if you've still got them in multiple layers, duplicate them all, flatten them or merge them, and then flip the layer vertically, like what I've done there, and then you just shift them and realign them to just sitting right underneath the objects themselves, right? And then you can drop the opacity, and that way you'll just create a really nice reflection of the objects, right? And you can also add in like a bit of a Gaussian blur, or just a blur, like a small blur, just to show that the ripples of the water is just giving off that effect. And that way you can create some really quick and easy reflections. Now I was going to paint in some water ripples, just keeping them to really simple, rough, playful even, and just, yeah, real sketchy lines here with the lighter blue. Right now I'm just going to paint in like a really nice big splash of wave in the foreground here, just to show that there's water hitting the close-up of the viewing camera here. We're just going to keep it just really rough and just give it a bit of shadow just to show that it's really in the foreground. And yeah, we're just going to keep it really energetic, keep it as real rough strokes, and that way it just looks like the water's really moving, just to give it some movement. Now we're just going to get into some clouds. Now when you're painting clouds, you've got to make sure that your clouds are actually flowing with the flow of your overall scene. Now this one is a pretty simple composition. It's going from just left and right. It's quite a horizontal piece. So I'm just going to make sure that my clouds are flowing from one side to the other quite nicely, instead of having, for example, rounded clouds. Because I want to create some movement in my clouds, and I always create movement. So I'm just going to continue doing that, and I'm going to make sure that my clouds are indeed flowing from one side to the other. And this is going to help create that visual flow throughout the whole scene. And it's just going to make the whole piece look a lot more interesting as well. Now in terms of painting the clouds themselves, I usually just go to the back, start a new layer, paint in the overall shape and silhouette like I usually do with everything else that I do. And then I'm just going to create a clipping mask on top of that. And then just grab the lighter variation of that color that you've used and just paint in some highlights, and based on where the light's coming from. So, and I just dabble a little bit with some of the edges, and that's usually enough lighting. I don't really go too hard out with the clouds because it's usually more of like a supporting element in my pieces. So I usually keep it really simple, like I'm doing here. I'm just sticking to two tones, just a slightly darker blue and a really lighter blue. Now pretty much from here onwards, it's more or less just refining the overall piece. I'm creating some light effects here, and that's just using that same patterned brush that I've got in my brush pack. You're just going to stamp it in, and then you can duplicate the same layer, set it on color dodge mode for your layer, and you can do some Gaussian blue, and that creates like a really nice glow on it like I've got there. And then I'm just going to paint in some birds as usual, just to create some of that scale, just to show how big the environment is compared to some of the other objects and elements that you see in the everyday. So using birds and using characters is a great way to do that. So we're just going to keep them small to make sure that your environment is showing the size that you're intending it for it to be. So now that everything is more or less there and more or less done, I'm just going to add in a character. I'm still trying to figure out at this point where I'm going to place it, but I'm just drawing it in first. But then ultimately it will go on top of on the tip of my cliff there. So it's going to go at the top of the cliff. And yeah, that'll pretty much be the end of this video. So you can continue watching and watch me build my character. But this pretty much is the last final stage of it. And that brings us to the end of this video, guys. Thanks so much for watching, and thanks so much for your support constantly on Patreon. Alright guys, and yeah, I will see you guys in the next video.